Malcolm Brooks had driven a city bus for 13 years and had never once accepted a tip. So, when a well-dressed businesswoman held out a $50 bill after he helped her recover a lost bag, he simply smiled and shook his head. Malcolm told her, "If I do the right thing only for money, then the right thing stops meaning anything." The woman said nothing and stepped off the bus in silence. But only a few hours later, the entire city would be stunned when she reappeared in front of Malcolm with an offer no one could have imagined: half ownership of a company worth billions of dollars. Before this unbelievable story unfolds, subscribe, like, and tell us, would you refuse $50 for doing the right thing? Malcolm Brooks was the kind of man people set their watches by. Every morning at 6:15, his bus rolled up to the corner of 5th and Union, exactly on time. Rain or shine, and the regulars who rode with him knew his name, his gentle voice, and the way he greeted every single passenger as if they were the only person on his route that day. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, with a quiet strength in his eyes that made people trust him instantly, though few of them knew why. He wore the same faded blue uniform every day, kept his shoes polished, and never once complained about the long hours or the difficult passengers who sometimes tested his patience. Among the drivers at the depot, Malcolm was something of a legend, not because of any dramatic story, but because of a simple fact that everyone repeated, like folklore. In 13 years behind the wheel, he had never accepted a single tip. People tried constantly. Elderly women pressed dollar bills into his palm for helping them up the steps, and businessmen once offered him $20 just to hold the bus an extra minute so they could make an important meeting. Malcolm always refused, always with the same calm explanation that his paycheck was payment enough for kindness, and that kindness given for a price was no longer kindness at all. It became something of a running joke on his route. Drivers at other depots, hearing about the man who could not be bribed with anything short of a favor, returned in kind. Nobody knew that Malcolm had once walked a very different path, one filled with engineering blueprints, boardroom meetings, and a brilliant career that ended the day his closest friend died in an accident that still haunted him. That morning, however, none of that mattered, because a storm was rolling into the city and Malcolm had a route to run. The rain came down in heavy gray sheets that morning, turning the streets into rivers and forcing pedestrians to duck beneath awnings. Malcolm's bus filled quickly with damp passengers, shaking water from their coats. Among them, a woman in her late 30s, dressed in a plain gray raincoat and worn sneakers, nothing like the tailored suits she usually wore. Her name was Victoria Ellison, and though not a single soul on that bus recognized her, she was the chief executive officer of Ellison Mobility Group, a transportation conglomerate worth billions. And she had come undercover that day to see with her own eyes how ordinary people experienced the city's transit system. She sat near the back, clutching a leather briefcase to her chest, watching Malcolm navigate the flooded streets with a steadiness that impressed her more than she expected. Victoria had ridden dozens of buses across the country in disguise over the past year, searching for the truth beneath the spreadsheets her executives handed her, and something about this particular driver caught her attention immediately. At her stop near the financial district, Victoria rose, quickly distracted by a phone call from her assistant about a merger that was falling apart, and she hurried off the bus without a backward glance. It was only 2 stops later, when Malcolm was clearing seats for the next group of riders, that he noticed the briefcase wedged beneath a seat forgotten in the rush. He opened it just enough to confirm it belonged to someone, and what he saw made his stomach tighten with concern. Merger contracts stamped confidential, a small hard drive, and documents marked with security clearances that clearly did not belong to an ordinary commuter. Rather than turning it over to Lost and Found and letting it sit for hours, Malcolm made a decision that would have gotten him fired. At most companies, he finished his current loop and then on his own time doubled back to every stop along. In the route, asking passengers if anyone remembered the woman in the gray raincoat. By the 3rd stop, he had learned nothing, and dispatch was radioing him about falling behind schedule, but Malcolm kept going anyway, driven by an instinct he could not quite explain. He thought of what could happen if that briefcase fell into the wrong hands, the kind of damage confidential contracts could do to a company and its employees. people whose jobs depended on secrets staying secret. As he pulled toward the fourth stop, soaked from stepping outside to check under the shelter, he saw a woman running through the rain toward the bus, her face pale with panic, her raincoat plastered to her body. It was Victoria, and the moment their eyes met through the fogged glass of the bus door, Malcolm understood that this was no ordinary commuter chasing down a forgotten bag. Victoria climbed aboard breathless and soaked, scanning the seats with desperate eyes before her gaze landed on Malcolm's face. "Please tell me," she said, her voice cracking. "Please tell me you found a briefcase." Malcolm reached beneath the driver's seat, where he had secured it, and held it out to her without a word, watching relief flood through her body like a wave breaking on shore. She checked the contents with trembling hands, the contracts, the hard drive, everything untouched, exactly as she had left it. And for a long moment, she simply stared at Malcolm, as though trying to understand how such a thing was possible in a city where people vanished, with far less valuable things, every single day. "You went back for me," Victoria said quietly, still catching her breath, disbelief written across her face. Malcolm shrugged, as though it were nothing at all, explaining that he could not, in good conscience, let something so important sit unclaimed for hours, not when someone was clearly counting on it. Around them, passengers watched the exchange with quiet curiosity, some smiling at the small drama unfolding on a rainy Tuesday morning. Victoria reached into her coat and pulled out her wallet, retrieving a crisp $50 bill, holding it toward Malcolm with the kind of confidence that suggested she had never once had money refused in her entire life. She wanted more than anything to properly thank the man who had just saved her from a catastrophe she could not yet fully explain to him. Malcolm looked at the bill, then at Victoria, and gently pushed her hand back toward her. "I appreciate it," he said, "but I can't take that." Victoria blinked in confusion, certain she had misheard him, and asked if he was serious because most people in this city would have taken the money without a second thought. Malcolm explained with the same calm steadiness and that selling his honesty for $50 would cheapen something that should never have a price attached to it. "I'm paid to serve my passengers," he said, "not to sell my integrity." The words landed on Victoria with an unexpected weight, and she found herself unable to respond right away, the $50 bill still hanging awkwardly between them. The rain outside had softened into a light drizzle by then, streaking the windows in thin silver lines, and the bus settled into the low hum of its idling engine, while the remaining passengers waited quietly to see how this strange exchange would end. A young mother near the middle of the bus adjusted her sleeping child on her lap and glanced up at Malcolm with quiet curiosity, sensing that something unusual had just happened, even if she could not name exactly what it was. Victoria remained standing near the front, seemingly unwilling to simply walk away without understanding this man a little better. Her briefcase now held loosely at her side, instead of pressed against her chest in panic. A few passengers nearby had been listening, and an older man near the front chuckled under his breath, muttering that Malcolm was a fool for turning down free money in a city where every dollar counted. Malcolm only smiled at the comment unbothered, the kind of smile that suggested he had heard worse and cared less. Victoria, still holding the bill, tilted her head and studied him with newfound curiosity rather than pity, asking him a question that seemed to slip out before she could stop it. What if there had been $1 million in that briefcase instead of contracts? She asked, watching his face closely for any flicker of hesitation. Malcolm did not hesitate at all, answering simply that the amount would have made no difference, that if anything, more value inside would only make it more important to return it exactly as he found it. Victoria lowered her hand, slowly tucking the $50 bill back into her wallet, her mind working through something Malcolm could not begin to guess. She thanked him again, quieter this time, almost to herself, and stepped off the bus at the next stop without asking his name or explaining who she was. Malcolm watched her disappear into the crowd, through his mirror already turning his attention back to the road and the next group of passengers waiting under dripping umbrellas. He had no idea that the woman he had just spoken to controlled a transportation empire employing tens of thousands of people, nor did he suspect that his simple refusal of $50 had just planted a seed that would grow into something enormous. For Malcolm, the moment was already fading into the rhythm of an ordinary workday. One more small kindness, among thousands he had offered without expecting anything in return. Victoria could not stop thinking about the driver for the rest of that day, replaying his words in her mind through back-to-back meetings that felt increasingly hollow by comparison. That evening, still unsettled, she called her head of legal affairs, a sharp and meticulous woman named Rebecca Miles, and asked her to quietly look into a city bus driver named Malcolm Brooks. Rebecca assumed it would be a simple background check, the kind of routine research she handled dozens of times a month. But what she discovered within 24 hours left her staring at her computer screen in disbelief. Malcolm Brooks, the bus driver, had once graduated at the top of his class in transportation systems, engineering from a respected university, a fact that seemed almost impossible to reconcile with his current occupation. Rebecca dug further, uncovering records that painted a picture far removed from the quiet man behind the wheel of a city bus. She pulled old conference programs, listing his name among keynote speakers, half his current age, technical journals crediting him with breakthroughs that transit engineers still referenced years later, and internal memos from a major transportation authority, praising the sheer elegance of a routing model that seemed at the time almost impossible to improve upon. None of it matched the humble uniform he wore each morning, and Rebecca found herself pausing more than once, rereading the same document twice, certain there had to be some mistake in the name matching. According to old professional records, Malcolm had once developed a routing optimization algorithm so effective that a major transit authority had used it to cut delays by nearly 30% across an entire metropolitan network. He had been nominated for a prestigious innovation award in transportation technology, an honor few engineers his age ever received, and he had co-developed a safety system alongside a close colleague that promised to prevent a category of accidents responsible for hundreds of deaths each year. Even more surprising, Rebecca found records showing that a major corporation had once offered Malcolm several $1,000,000 to purchase the rights to his patent outright, an offer he had flatly declined without explanation. Something had happened after that, something that caused Malcolm to disappear from the engineering world entirely, leaving behind conferences, publications, and a career trajectory that should have led to enormous wealth and recognition. Rebecca traced the disintegration of his career to a single tragic accident, one in which the very colleague who had helped him design that safety system was killed during a live field test that went catastrophically wrong. Public records suggested Malcolm had blamed himself for pushing the testing schedule forward under pressure from investors eager to see results, though details remained sparse, protected by settlements and non-disclosure agreements from years earlier. After the accident, Malcolm vanished from the industry, entirely resurfacing months later as an ordinary city bus driver, a role that seemed on paper like a dramatic fall from grace. But as Rebecca compiled her findings and presented them to Victoria the following morning, both women began to see the decision differently, not as failure, but as a deliberate choice. Malcolm had walked away from wealth, prestige, and power to spend his days serving ordinary people directly, one bus route at a time. And something about that choice struck Victoria as far more remarkable than any resume could capture. Victoria read through the file twice, lingering on the details of the patent he had refused to sell, and the promotion he had walked away from without a public statement. She found herself less interested in pity and more consumed by genuine fascination, wondering what kind of man turns his back on millions of dollars, not once but apparently many times over. The image of Malcolm gently pushing her $50 bill back across the seat replayed in her mind alongside this new information, and the two moments began to fit together like pieces of a puzzle she had not realized she was solving. She thanked Rebecca for the thorough work and asked her to keep the file confidential, for now some instinct telling her that this discovery might matter far more than either of them yet understood. Neither woman could have predicted just how soon that instinct would be tested. Trouble at Ellison Mobility Group had been building quietly for months before it finally erupted into full crisis. The company's newly implemented artificial intelligence dispatch system, meant to revolutionize scheduling across their entire fleet, had instead begun producing catastrophic errors, sending buses to the wrong routes and creating delays that stretched into hours during peak commuting times. Costs spiraled as the company scrambled to patch failures with expensive manual overrides, and customer complaints flooded in faster than the support team could process them. Major shareholders, alarmed by the sudden drop in service reliability and a corresponding slide in the stock price, began murmuring about an emergency vote to replace Victoria as chief executive before the situation spun further out of control. It was without exaggeration the most dangerous moment of Victoria's decade-long tenure, running the company her own grandfather had founded. Late night, calls from nervous investors became routine, each one asking the same question in a dozen different ways, wondering whether the woman who had inherited the company truly had the strength to steer it through a storm. This, severe. Newspapers that had once praised Victoria as a rising star in the transportation industry now ran headlines questioning whether Ellison Mobility could survive the quarter, and every fresh delay reported by frustrated commuters seemed to chip away a little more at investor confidence. Victoria found herself sleeping less and less, poring over reports late into the night, searching for a solution that none of her highly credentialed engineers seemed able to provide. Ethan Caldwell, the company's chief operating officer, saw opportunity where Victoria saw crisis. A sharp, ambitious executive who had never fully accepted playing second in command, Ethan used the emergency board meetings to push aggressive cost-cutting measures that Victoria found deeply troubling. He proposed layoffs across multiple departments, reduced maintenance schedules for aging vehicles, and a scaling back of safety training programs, all framed as necessary sacrifices to stabilize quarterly earnings and calm nervous shareholders. Victoria rejected every one of his proposals, outright arguing that cutting corners on safety would only trade a short-term financial crisis for a much larger human catastrophe down the road. The tension between them grew sharper with each meeting, Ethan quietly building support among certain board members who preferred numbers on a spreadsheet to the harder questions Victoria kept raising about the people those numbers represented. Alone in her office, late one night, staring at charts that showed no clear path forward, Victoria found her mind drifting back to the bus driver who had refused her $50. She thought about his answer regarding the hypothetical $1 million in that briefcase, his insistence that the right thing never changes based on the stakes involved. Something about his clarity, his refusal to compromise, even in small moments, felt like exactly the kind of thinking her company desperately needed at its highest levels. It was an unconventional idea, perhaps even an irrational one, but Victoria had built her career on trusting instincts that others dismissed too quickly. Before she could talk herself out of it, she picked up her phone and asked her assistant to find out which bus depot Malcolm Brooks reported to each morning. 2 days later, Victoria arrived at the depot, just as Malcolm was finishing his shift, still dressed casually rather than in the tailored suits her employees were accustomed to seeing her wear. Malcolm recognized her instantly, assuming she had simply returned to thank him again, or perhaps to insist he take some form of reward he would inevitably decline. Instead, Victoria asked him to visit her company headquarters, explaining briefly that she believed he might have valuable insight into a problem her team was struggling to solve. Malcolm's first instinct was to refuse, telling her plainly that he did not belong in glass towers filled with executives who spoke a language of profit margins he had left behind years ago. Victoria pressed gently, but persistently, sensing that beneath his reluctance was not arrogance, but a genuine discomfort with a world he had chosen to leave. She explained just enough about the crisis to pique his curiosity without revealing everything, describing routing failures and cascading delays that sounded remarkably similar to problems he had once studied deeply during his engineering career. Malcolm listened carefully, old instincts stirring despite years spent trying to suppress them, and something in Victoria's description of the failing algorithm nagged at a part of his brain he had long kept dormant. After several minutes of quiet consideration, he agreed to visit the headquarters, just once, framing it to himself as simply satisfying his own curiosity rather than any real commitment to helping. When word spread through Ellison Mobility's executive offices that their embattled CEO was bringing in a city bus driver to examine a multi-million-dollar technical crisis, the reaction ranged from confusion to open mockery. Several senior executives, including Ethan, could barely contain their skepticism, wondering aloud what a man who drove a bus for a living could possibly understand about enterprise-level transportation systems. The boardroom on the day of Malcolm's visit buzzed with tension before he even arrived. Engineers and executives locked in yet another circular argument about which department bore responsibility for the ongoing failures. When Malcolm walked in wearing simple slacks and a plain shirt, several people exchanged glances that made their doubts obvious without a single word being spoken. Victoria introduced him briefly, and without excessive explanation, then invited everyone to continue the discussion as though he were simply another observer in the room. For nearly an hour, Malcolm said almost nothing, sitting quietly at the edge of the table while engineers argued over charts, projections, and competing theories about what had gone wrong with the dispatch algorithm. He listened to terms he had not used in years, drift casually across the room, watched younger engineers defend their code with the same nervous energy he remembered from his own early career, and noticed more than once small inconsistencies in the numbers being presented that nobody else in the room seemed to catch. A junior analyst near the end of the table kept glancing toward him, clearly wondering why a stranger in plain clothes had been allowed into a meeting this sensitive, though nobody dared to ask the question directly with Victoria sitting at the head of the table. He watched carefully, occasionally requesting to see specific data sets, his expression unreadable to the executives who had already dismissed him as an outsider who did not belong. Finally, as the arguing reached another dead end, Malcolm rose from his seat and walked toward the large display screen at the front of the room, asking permission to pull up the raw routing data from the previous week. Within minutes of scanning through the numbers, he identified an inconsistency buried deep within the algorithm's decision, weighting a flaw so subtle that automated testing systems had repeatedly failed to catch it. He explained in clear and patient language how a set of variables meant to account for traffic pattern predictions had been quietly corrupted, producing results that looked statistically plausible but were fundamentally skewed. Rebecca, seated near the back of the room, felt a chill run through her as she recognized the same precision she had read about in Malcolm's old engineering records, now unfolding live in front of everyone. Within 10 minutes, Malcolm had not only identified the corrupted data, but demonstrated, using a simple manual recalculation, exactly how the forecasting model had been manipulated to produce artificially poor results. The room fell into stunned silence as engineers scrambled to verify his findings against their own systems, only to confirm one by one that everything Malcolm had described matched perfectly. Executives who had walked in prepared to humor Victoria's strange decision now sat staring at the bus driver with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant respect. Ethan, standing near the front of the room, felt a distinct unease creeping through his chest, his expression tightening as Malcolm continued explaining the discrepancies with calm, methodical precision. Something about the specific nature of the manipulation, the way certain values had been altered just enough to avoid automatic detection, suggested this was not a simple technical glitch, but a deliberate act carried out by someone with intimate knowledge of the system. Victoria watched Ethan's reaction closely, a suspicion beginning to form in the back of her mind that she was not yet ready to voice aloud. Over the following days, Malcolm continued working alongside Rebecca and a small team of trusted engineers, digging deeper into the corrupted algorithm to understand exactly how and when the manipulation had occurred. What they uncovered was far more troubling than a simple mistake, a carefully hidden pattern of alterations traced back through months of code changes, each one small enough to avoid drawing attention on its own. Rebecca cross-referenced access logs against the timeline of the changes, narrowing down the list of employees who had both the authority and the technical knowledge required to make such precise modifications. Late one evening, Rebecca sat alone in her office, surrounded by printed spreadsheets and highlighted timelines connecting dates and login credentials, until a pattern finally emerged from what had once looked like meaningless noise. Malcolm, who had stayed late as well, reviewed her findings with the same methodical patience he had shown in the boardroom, occasionally circling a figure or suggesting she cross-reference it against an earlier version of the code. The evidence increasingly pointed toward a scheme designed not to accidentally harm the company, but to deliberately manufacture a crisis severe enough to tank the stock price. Whoever was responsible appeared to be positioning themselves to acquire shares at a drastically reduced value through a series of shell companies planning to profit enormously once the manipulated crisis inevitably passed and share prices recovered. When Rebecca finally assembled enough evidence to bring before Victoria the trail, led with painful clarity back to Ethan Caldwell, whose fingerprints, both digital and financial, were scattered throughout the scheme, Victoria called an emergency private meeting, confronting Ethan directly with the mounting evidence, while Malcolm and Rebecca stood quietly nearby, prepared to present their findings if necessary. Ethan denied everything at first, his voice sharp with practiced confidence, insisting that any irregularities in the code were simply the result of overworked engineers making honest mistakes under pressure. He maintained his composure, impressively deflecting each accusation with the smooth confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable within the company he had helped build. It was only when Malcolm calmly pointed to a single line of buried code, one containing a specific formatting quirk that matched precisely with Ethan's known personal coding style from years earlier, that the room fell completely silent. For a moment, nobody in the room spoke. The only sound, the faint hum of the air conditioning, and the soft click of Rebecca's pen as she set it down on the table. Ethan opened his mouth, as if to offer one more denial, then closed it again, seeming to understand, perhaps for the first time, that the careful narrative he had constructed over so many months had finally collapsed under the weight of a frowst. Single overlooked detail. Ethan's face drained of color as he stared at the screen. The small detail he had overlooked now, standing as undeniable proof of his involvement, a signature he had unknowingly left behind in his own manipulation of the system. Within hours, Victoria authorized a full internal audit, bringing in an independent team to formally investigate the extent of Ethan's actions and the shell companies connected to his personal finances. The audit confirmed everything Rebecca and Malcolm had uncovered, revealing a scheme months in the making, designed to quietly siphon control of the company away from Victoria, while devastating employees and shareholders who trusted the leadership to protect their interests. Ethan was removed from his position, immediately escorted from the building, under the watchful eyes of security, while stunned employees looked on in disbelief. The crisis that had nearly destroyed Ellison Mobility Group had, in the span of just over a week, been traced back to its source and stopped entirely, all because of a bus driver who had simply refused to look away from a broken system. With the corrupted algorithm corrected and the fraudulent scheme exposed, Ellison Mobility's stock price began a steady recovery, climbing back toward its previous value, as confidence returned among shareholders and the public alike. News of the internal fraud and of the unlikely outsider who had helped uncover it began circulating quietly through the company's offices. Employees whispering about the humble bus driver who had walked into a boardroom and solved what dozens of highly paid engineers could not. Victoria felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude toward Malcolm, aware that his intervention had likely saved the company from collapse and protected the jobs of tens of thousands of employees who depended on it. She wanted to reward him properly, offering a substantial cash bonus, large enough to change his life, along with a luxury vehicle and even the deed to a house in one of the city's most desirable neighborhoods. Malcolm listened politely to each offer, his expression calm and unmoved, before declining every single one with the same quiet firmness he had shown from their very first conversation on the bus. Victoria's assistant had even prepared paperwork in advance, certain that no reasonable person could turn down a house, a car, and a life-changing sum of money all at once. And she stood by, awkwardly holding the folder, as Malcolm shook his head for the third time in a row. Rebecca, watching from across the office, found herself thinking back to the file she had compiled weeks earlier, remembering now that Malcolm had once turned down millions of dollars for his patent under nearly identical circumstances. Victoria pressed further, genuinely confused by his continued resistance, offering him instead a senior executive position within the company, complete with a salary that would have seemed unimaginable to him just weeks earlier. Malcolm shook his head gently, explaining that accepting rewards for simply doing what was right would undermine the very principle that had guided every decision he had made since stepping away from his engineering career years ago. If I accept a reward for doing the right thing, he said, then I already would have taken that $50 back on the bus. The word spread quickly through the company, repeated first among the small group who witnessed the exchange, then throughout entire departments, as employees shared the story with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Within days, it seemed as though every person working for Ellison Mobility Group had heard some version of Malcolm's simple, unwavering statement. The effect on company morale was immediate and profound. Employees, who had spent weeks anxious about layoffs and collapsing stock values, now speaking openly about a renewed sense of pride in the organization they worked for. During an all-staff gathering called to formally address the recent crisis, thousands of employees rose to their feet in spontaneous applause when Victoria briefly acknowledged Malcolm's role in saving the company, though he had insisted on remaining out of the spotlight as much as possible. Word of the story began reaching beyond the company itself. Local journalists picking up on rumors of a bus driver who had uncovered corporate fraud and then refused every reward offered to him. Victoria found herself facing a decision far more significant than any bonus or promotion could represent, one that would require far more thought than the simple gestures Malcolm had already turned down. She began quietly considering something that no consultant or board member would ever have recommended, an idea that felt both reckless and somehow entirely correct. In the days leading up to the announcement, Victoria met privately with her closest advisors, several of whom quietly questioned whether offering half the company to a bus driver, however brilliant, was a decision she might come to regret. She listened patiently to every concern raised, weighing each one carefully against the memory of a rainy morning, a returned briefcase, and a $50 bill that had somehow changed the course of everything that followed. In the end, none of the objections moved her, because Victoria had spent enough years surrounded by ambitious, capable people who nonetheless lacked the one quality that mattered most, and she was not willing to let that quality slip away simply because it arrived in an unexpected form. Victoria called for a formal shareholder meeting larger and more heavily attended than any gathering in the company's recent history, with journalists and financial analysts filling seats alongside major investors, eager to understand exactly what had transpired. Standing before the assembled crowd, she recounted the full story in careful detail, describing how Malcolm had refused a simple tip out of principle, how that refusal had led her to investigate his background, and how his expertise had ultimately exposed a scheme that could have destroyed the company entirely. She explained that Malcolm had not only identified the corrupted algorithm within minutes of arriving, but had also protected tens of thousands of jobs, prevented billions of dollars in potential losses, and safeguarded the company's reputation at a moment when everything seemed on the verge of collapse. The room listened in rapt attention, many hearing the complete story for the first time, understanding now why their CEO had become so visibly changed in recent weeks. Victoria paused, letting the weight of Malcolm's contributions settle over the crowd before continuing toward the announcement she had been building toward. "I do not need another employee," Victoria said, her voice steady, despite the enormity of what she was about to propose. "I need a partner, someone who has already proven, beyond any doubt, that he values integrity over profit at every single turn." She then announced to a room that fell utterly silent, in response, that she intended to offer Malcolm 50% ownership of Ellison Mobility Group, transforming him from an anonymous city bus driver into an equal partner in a company worth billions of dollars. Gasps rippled through the crowd, reporters immediately scribbling notes, while investors exchanged stunned glances, none of them having anticipated an announcement of this magnitude. Malcolm, standing quietly near the side of the stage, where Victoria had asked him to remain, felt every eye in the room shift toward him, the weight of the moment settling over his shoulders like something almost physical. For several long seconds he said absolutely nothing, staring out at the crowd, while a lifetime of choices, sacrifices, and quiet convictions seemed to converge into a single impossible moment. Malcolm did not accept the offer immediately, asking instead for time to consider what such a partnership would truly mean, both for himself and for the thousands of people whose livelihoods depended on the company's decisions. When he finally returned to Victoria several days later, He arrived not with excitement or hesitation, but with a clear set of conditions that reflected everything he had believed in throughout his years behind the wheel of a city bus. He asked that no employees be laid off without just cause, that the company commit significant resources toward improving safety standards across its entire fleet, and that driver training programs receive substantially greater investment than they had in the past. He further requested the creation of a scholarship fund dedicated to supporting students pursuing careers in transportation engineering, ensuring that talented young people without wealth or connections could still access the education that had once shaped his own career. Above all, he insisted that profit would never again be placed above the safety and well-being of the people. The company served, a principle he made clear, was non-negotiable, regardless of what any partnership agreement might say. He also asked, almost as an afterthought, that the company set aside a portion of its profits every single year to maintain older vehicles rather than retiring them the moment newer models became fashionable, insisting that safety should never depend on a machine's age, but on how well it was cared for. Victoria listened to each request without interrupting, nodding slowly as she recognized in his words the same steady logic that had guided every decision he had made since the day she first met him. Victoria agreed to every condition without hesitation, recognizing in Malcolm's requests the very values that had drawn her to him in the first place, back on that rainy morning when he refused her $50. The formal partnership was finalized within weeks, transforming Ellison Mobility Group into a company led jointly by a woman who had inherited an empire and a man who had once walked away from one, choosing instead to serve strangers from behind the wheel of a bus. Under their combined leadership, the company rapidly earned a reputation as the most trusted transportation provider in the country, praised not only for its improved reliability, but for the ethical standards Malcolm had insisted upon from the very beginning. Drivers who had once dreaded quarterly reviews now spoke about feeling genuinely heard by leadership for the first time in their careers, and maintenance crews reported that new safety protocols, though demanding, made them proud rather than resentful of the work they did every day. Employees spoke openly about feeling valued in ways they never had before, and customers noticed a level of care and consistency that seemed increasingly rare in an industry often criticized for cutting corners. Analysts who once questioned Victoria's judgment now cited the partnership as a case study in responsible leadership, and competitors quietly began revising their own policies to keep pace with a standard they had never expected a rival to set. What had begun as a small act of quiet integrity on a rainy morning had grown into something that reshaped an entire corporation from the inside out. Harold Grant, an elderly retired professor who had witnessed the very first exchange between Malcolm and Victoria on that crowded, rain-soaked bus so many months earlier, happened to read about the announcement in the newspaper while sitting in his favorite chair by the window. He remembered clearly the moment Malcolm had pushed that $50 bill back across the seat, the quiet dignity in his voice, and the way several passengers, himself included, had assumed the driver was simply being foolish. He thought about how easily he could have dismissed that moment as nothing more than a small, forgettable act of stubbornness, and the kind of thing people forget within a week, and yet somehow it had grown into a story now spreading through newspapers and dinner table conversations across the entire city. Harold folded the newspaper closed and allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, understanding now what he had only sensed intuitively that morning on the bus. A man who cannot be bought for $50, he murmured to himself. Setting the paper aside is exactly the kind of man who deserves an entire fortune. Despite his new title, his new responsibilities, and the enormous wealth now attached to his name, Malcolm continued to arrive at the depot every Monday morning, climbing behind the wheel of his familiar bus, just as he had for 13 years. Before everything changed, he told the few people who asked that the routine kept him grounded, a weekly reminder that dignity was never something measured by a title, a salary, or the size of a bank account. What carried him from complete anonymity to co-ownership of a billion-dollar corporation was never luck, nor timing, nor even the crisis that happened to bring his talents to light in dramatic fashion. It was simply and entirely a lifetime of refusing to trade his integrity for any amount of money, no matter how large the number or how quietly the offer was made. And on quiet Monday mornings, as familiar faces boarded his bus and greeted him by name, Malcolm Brooks remained exactly who he had always been, a man who understood that some things are worth infinitely more than the price anyone could ever offer for them.